getting back to the amazing pronouncements that have come out, and I'm still reeling from reading this story about Obama's presidential policy directives, the PPDs. These are things that go even beyond executive orders because we're not even allowed to know what the subjects of these executive orders are. So they're like executive orders, except they're secret. Congress doesn't know what they are. We're not allowed to know what they are, but we must obey them. See a problem with that? I do. I see a lot of problems with that. And when I look at this, I have the same reaction that Jeff Sessions, I don't know if it's, I get their names mixed up. There's a Congressman Sessions and there's a Senator Sessions. Senator Sessions took a look at the Trans-Pacific Partnership. And what he told us about it, he was absolutely appalled. He said, I'm just breathless as to what's going on with this. And I got to say, that's the way I feel this last week. I am just breathless with the insanity and with how quickly everything is moving with all of this. Hopefully it's going to wake people up. Hopefully people will see that this is something that has been rolling out for a very long time. And I want to talk about what's going on with Greece in just a moment and go back to a book that Alex Jones wrote back in 2002. He mentioned it briefly yesterday, and there was a transcript in there of an interview that he had with Greg Palast, and he was talking about interviews that he had with Joe Stiglitz. Joe Stiglitz has something to say about Greece that is very relevant to today, to what's going on with the bankers there, as well as with these trade agreements. And I want to pull that in. But before we do, I want to get back to the TPP from the story here about the anti-slavery clause. Now, this is an article that came out yesterday evening from Kit Daniels. He points out that right before Obama publicly attacked the Confederate flag as a symbol of slavery, President Obama quietly removed an anti-slavery provision from the Trans-Pacific Partnership Trade Agreement. This partnership bars countries that engage in slavery from being part of major trade deals with the U.S. It was written by Senator Bob Menendez from New Jersey. This is a report from the Huffington Post. They say, at the insistence of the White House, however, Menendez agreed to modify his language to say that as long as a country is taking, quote, concrete steps, unquote, towards reducing human trafficking and forced labor, it can still be a part of the trade deal. Now, the reason they had to do this is because they want to get Malaysia in. Malaysia is a major source of cheap labor, and it's also a major source of human trafficking in Southeast Asia. They have enslaved men, women, and children subjected to forced labor and sex trafficking, according to the State Department, according to this article that Kit Daniels has. And the Huffington Post asks, why in the year 2015 is the White House teaming up with Republican leaders essentially to defend the practice of slavery? But that's okay, because that's being done quietly. Publicly, Obama is going to the black churches, singing Amazing Grace. He is removing the Confederate flag because that is all about slavery. He says, well, actually, Lincoln didn't even start the war to end slavery. He started the war to stop secession. If you go back and read some of the original stuff, you'll see they're not calling the people in rebellion. They called them rebels, but mostly they called them secession. Lincoln didn't free the slaves with the Emancipation Proclamation in 1863. That happened in 1865. They finally freed the slaves of Ulysses S. Grant. And if you're historically challenged, he was the commander of the Union forces, and he had slaves on his farm, his wife's farm, until 1865 when they were outlawed, when the amendments went through to do that. Now, that was the 13th Amendment. The 14th Amendment said that they were going to extend due process to the freed slaves. In 1870, they extended voting rights specifically to the slaves. So they did these things in the steps of progression because they had to explicitly put it in there. They weren't, these different rights were not being given to the freed slaves. And it's kind of interesting when you look at the Supreme Court decision that came out this week, where they threw out Arizona and Kansas's voter IDs. They had a policy that they would request proof of citizenship before someone could be added to the voter registration rolls. And the Supreme Court says, no, you don't need to do that. They can just tell you they're citizens, and that's okay. Really? Is it okay if I just tell the TSA, don't worry, I'm a citizen, I'm not a threat, you don't need to see any documents. These are not the drones you're looking for, just let me through. No, that doesn't work anywhere else. If I refuse to give a police officer my ID when he requests it or demands it, I'm going to wind up face down on the concrete in most situations. That's what we've seen. That's the rules that the federal government is putting out as they federalize police enforcement. But, you know, when we look at voting, this is something that was never defined in the Constitution, who gets to vote. So there were definitions that went through. We had 3 amendments that have been put in the Constitution to clarify that. In 1870, they added an amendment to allow people to vote regardless of race, color, or previous condition of servitude. So that was 1870. 50 years later, 1920, allowed the right to vote regardless of sex. That gave women the right to vote. Then in 1970, another 50 years. Interesting. These are like 50 years apart. They have the voting age lowered to 18 years. And quite frankly, they did that because they were sending men off to die and not allowing them to vote in the wars. They were drafting people at 18 years of age. So, you know, just like the Constitution doesn't say you've got freedom of speech or freedom of religion, it just says you have those because those rights come from God. That's what the Declaration of Independence tells us. You possess those rights as a human being. So the Constitution is there to say you're not going to infringe on those rights on any kind of basis, not on the basis of race, not on the basis of sex or age. That's why we had those 3 amendments. Now we come back 45 years after this last one, where they gave the vote to 18-year-olds, and the Supreme Court doesn't go through the usual process. Because when you look at these 3 amendments, they were each 50 years apart, they all had a format to them. They all came in and they said, they had 2 parts. Section 1, the right of citizens of the U.S. to vote shall not be denied or abridged because of fill in the blank, race, sex, age, okay? That was the first part. The second part said, Congress shall have the power to enforce this article by appropriate legislation. In other words, Congress can't write laws when they don't have jurisdiction over something. But see, we're at the point now where the Supreme Court doesn't even wait for Congress to write the laws on things that they don't have jurisdiction. The Supreme Court makes pronouncements on things that even the federal government in no branch has jurisdiction over. And that's what they have done by saying we cannot verify who citizens are. Because in each of these amendments, it was citizens of the United States have the right to vote and cannot be abridged because of this. It is citizens who have that right. But of course, the Supreme Court doesn't need to be bothered with that. They will just make their little declaration. Because as I said before, these are 9 kings and queens with the ring of power who have essentially become Nazgul, ring race. Remember Lord of the Rings? The men who took the power as kings and they were corrupted by it. That's what we have seen. That's what everyone was always concerned about. Lord Acton, who said power corrupts and absolute power corrupts absolutely, they were concerned, he was concerned, and his contemporaries who founded this country were concerned about the consolidation of power, about people becoming arbitrary dictators. What is a dictator? A dictator is someone who says, the law is in my mouth, essentially. He dictates what that law is. And that's what we have now. Except, of course, you have the presidential policy directives where we cannot even see what the dictates are because those are secret laws. Yes, we have truly gone to a corrupt government where the emperor has no clothes. And one of the things that they have to do with us, of course, is to make sure that they remove all the foundations, historical, legal, of our country. That's what's really behind this removal of the 10 Commandments in Oklahoma, as well as other places. We have monuments at the Supreme Court. When we talked about the 800th anniversary of the Magna Carta, we talked about how that was one of the panels on the door of the Supreme Court. They put monuments up to talk about this is where our laws came from. We have this long tradition, so forth and so on. And many of the states refer directly to the Magna Carta. We also have a foundation. We talk about America being a Christian nation. That doesn't mean that the majority of people were Christians, although they were. Doesn't mean that the majority of the founders were Christians, although they were. What it means is that our laws were based on that philosophically, ethically. That was the foundation. And that's what people are putting these monuments up. But we have to take the monuments down because we are removing the foundations of our country. We are headed into a Mordor when we give this kind of power to these people.
I want to make this announcement now. It's going up as we speak, a day early.
To celebrate the birth of our country and give a big thanks to all the info warriors out there, we are now offering free shipping on every item shipped out of the InfoWarsStore.com warehouse. That's free shipping on all t-shirts, books, and DVDs. Free shipping on Molon Labe and 1776 belt buckles, which are also 25% off while supplies last. Free shipping on all of our InfoWarsLife.com nutraceuticals. If it's in the InfoWarsStore.com warehouse, it's shipping for free, all during the month of July. It's our way of saying thanks to the true heart and soul of this operation, who stand beside us and support us as we wage an info war for liberty and freedom for all. InfoWarsStore.com, free shipping for the month of July.
As to what's going on with this. And I got to say, that's the way I feel this last week. I am just breathless with the insanity and with how quickly everything is moving with all of this. Hopefully it's going to wake people up. Hopefully people will see that this is something that has been rolling out for a very long time. And I want to talk about what's going on with Greece in just a moment and go back to a book that Alex Jones wrote back in 2002. He mentioned it briefly yesterday, and there was a transcript in there of an interview that he had with Greg Palast, and he was talking about interviews that he had had with Joe Stiglitz. Joe Stiglitz has something to say about Greece that is very relevant to today, to what's going on with the bankers there, as well as with these trade agreements. And I want to pull that in. I see a lot of problems with that. And, you know, when I look at this, I have the same reaction that Jeff Sessions, I don't know if it's, I get their names mixed up. There's a Congressman Sessions and there's a Senator Sessions. Senator Sessions took a look at the Trans-Pacific Partnership. And what he told us about it, he was absolutely appalled. He said, I'm just breathless about Obama's presidential policy directives, the PPDs. These are things that go even beyond executive orders because we're not even allowed to know what the subjects of these executive orders are. So they're like executive orders, except they're secret. Congress doesn't know what they are. We're not allowed to know what they are, but we must obey them. See a problem with that? I do. Now, getting back to the amazing pronouncements that have come out, and I'm still reeling from reading this story.